equal pleasure that I introduce Armisted Maupin. You know that he launched in 1976 this serial that was published in the San Francisco Chronicle that became Tales of the City. 8 novels, a mini-series, and a musical later. He's still churning the books out, and this January you'll receive The Days of Anna Madrigal. We'll come back. In my mind, Tales of the City pull back the curtains to reveal the joy, the suffering, the sex, the delight, and the magic that is San Francisco, and more profoundly reveal the complicated human journey that we're all part of. In talking with Oscar Villalone, the editor at Zizova, about Armisted's work, he said, he's our Balzac. He's the author of a book that traces the human tragedy and comedy of San Francisco, this parade we call San Francisco. He's received multiple awards, the Trevor Project's Life Award for his efforts in saving young lives. He's the first recipient of Litquake's Barbary Coast Award for his literary contributions to San Francisco. In 2012, he was awarded Lambda's Pioneer Award bestowed on individuals who've broken new ground in the field of LGBT literature and publishing. Please join me in welcoming Armisted Maupin.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you, Armisted, for being here and participating in this conversation.
My pleasure.
So let's start. I'll do the worst thing a book critic can do. Let me start by asking you about a book I haven't read. Let's talk about the new novel a little bit. When Marianne in Autumn came out, you talked about the idea that you were hoping to return to these characters and return to the Tales of the City cycle, but you weren't sure. You were playing around with it, but you weren't sure how far it was going to go. Obviously, I have nothing specific to ask about the book, and I don't want to give away anything, but is this a signal that the Tales of the City is back and here to stay?
This is actually the end.
Really?
Okay, well, I got to throw out all these questions.
I returned to Tales of the City with Michael Tolliver Lives before Marianne in Autumn, after having announced that it was the end in 1989 with a novel called Sure of You. I can now confess that one of the reasons that I stopped was that I had established that Michael Tolliver, the main gay character, was HIV positive, and I didn't want to write one more story where the gay man died at the end. I wanted to leave him happy and brave and living his life to the fullest. But this was at a time where the assumption was that an HIV positive diagnosis was a death sentence. Everyone you knew who got it died. And it wasn't until the protease inhibitors cocktails came along that I sat around thinking, I'd really like to write a story about a survivor, about someone who has been through the epidemic and is still around and is now middle-aged, facing the realities of actual mortality as opposed to the threats of AIDS. So and then I realized I had such a man in my repertoire, Michael Tolliver. So I brought him back and I wrote a first-person novel. It was the only departure from the normal Tales of the City format of multiple characters intertwining.
And all third person. The other books are third person. Michael Tolliver
is first person.
Is the only first person.
Yeah, it's the only first person. But there were critics that hated it in places, especially Britain for some reason, but that hated the notion. They said I was being too indulgently autobiographical, which just made me laugh so hard because I was more Dee Dee Halcyon Day than Michael Tolliver. or Marianne, for that matter. When people started saying to me, "Why did she become such a bitch?" I would get really personal. I once between when I was single, let's say, I was in Paris and did a reading, and afterwards I went to the little gay bar around the corner and got very, very drunk on whatever that milky licorice thing is. No, anyway. no, I guess it was. Whatever it was, I ended up in bed with two guys, partners. I know you didn't think this was going to go this way.
You can go whichever way it goes.
They were both really drunk, and they just scared the hell out of me because they veered very sharply to keep from going through Princess Diana's death tunnel in Paris, the place where she died. They were superstitious about it. We got back to the hotel, had a great, jolly romp with each other, and later were lying there like a bunch of puppies in a basket. And these two guys started talking to each other in English, but broken English, French broken English. You ask him. No, you ask him. I don't want to ask him. You ask him. Go ahead. All right, I'll ask him. I'll ask him. Why did Marianne become such a bitch? Single thing that I've been asked the most in the course of my literary career.
This is how you know you've made it as a writer, when you get asked that question in that situation.
I love especially in that. I love the way in which people relate to the characters, and I love feeling that connection to them when I'm writing. And even as I was writing, I mean, Marianne sort of redeems herself in Marianne in Autumn. She goes through some hard times. She's proven to have grown. The latest one, the one that you asked me to talk about, is coming out January 21st, the Days of Anna Madrigal, is the first time I've ever broken out of time. I've always followed real time. And I think I've been afraid of going into the past, but I thought if I want to tell Anna Madrigal's story, I really have to go back to her boyhood in the brothel in Winnemucca, Nevada, and find out exactly what it was that made her run away to San Francisco. And so, thank heavens I live in the days of the internet, because you can just Google, you can sit there and write 1930s whorehouse menu. and there it is.
And you also know you're giving a charge to the guys from the NSA who are monitoring.
I'm far gone on that. I make reference in the novel to something called a dry bob. It took me the longest time to find out what. You'll have to read the book to find out what a dry bob is.
Right. We don't want to give away. We don't want to give too many spoilers.
Yeah.
I want to cycle back and sort of talk about the whole series, a little bit about the origins and all of that. But I just want to say that I agree with Oscar in the sense of it being Balzacian or maybe Dickensian. I know that you've been compared to those writers in the sense that the whole series together I read it as installments in a single novel, and the novel is really the story of San Francisco over the last, dating back to the mid-1970s. I want to get a sense, I know you started writing it for a smaller paper, the Pacific Sun, is that in Marin County, before 1976. Can you talk about sort of the origins of the idea, how you began to think about it, and why the newspaper?
I had a friend named Patty McGettigan. I think Will Hurst knows Patty Vallejo McGettigan, who told me when I was writing for the Pacific Sun, sort of around the town kind of column. It was the San Francisco edition of the Pacific Sun. She said, you really have to go down to the Marina Safeway on a Wednesday night and see this phenomenon that was called Social Safeway, which was straight people cruising each other at the grocery store, specifically at the vegetable bin. The Scotsman, Alistair Reid, who finally directed the Tales of the City miniseries, did some very interesting things with zucchinis in that particular scene. But I went down to the Marina Safeway, and there were a lot of overdressed young women in sort of rhinestone-studded brushed denim pantsuits, the garb of the day. And but I couldn't find anybody that would actually tell a reporter, yes, I'm here to get laid tonight. And so I went home very frustrated and made up a young woman in town named Marianne Singleton. And it made it into a little story where at the end of it she meets the guy of her dreams, and he's there with the man of his dreams. And it struck a real nerve with a lot of San Franciscans, especially straight single women who were gradually figuring out that it wasn't the best shopping to be done for men around here. And Steve McNamara at the Pacific Sun said, why don't you do this every week and take us to a different place?
It was a weekly paper.
It was a weekly paper. So I started grabbing everything I knew about. One of them was the baths at that point. I knew a lot about the baths at that point. And other local phenomena. And then the characters started kind of talking to each other. I'd always had, even before I wrote Tales of the City, I had an address in mind. I had 28 Barbary Lane in my head because I always fancied the notion of creating a place that people would come looking for that didn't really exist. Just the way I did with Tara when I was a teenager. I know it's fiction, but where would it be if it were here? So that caught the eye of Charles McKay, who was the distinguished, hard-drinking, Irish, homophobic, and curiously sweet columnist at the Chronicle. And someone overheard him, I think it was Virginia Westover, who was the society columnist at the Chronicle, saying that this would work for the Chronicle because all of us columnists are, in his words, a bunch of old farts about to fall off the hooks. I never knew what that meant. But his theory was that it wouldn't compete with any of the other columnists because it was fiction.
And the Chronicle was a very column-driven newspaper. I mean, there were a lot of signature voices.
Yeah. Ever since the days of Scott Newhall, they did wacky, crazy things to keep people interested in the newspaper. Treasure hunts in town, and what was his name? The old queen that told the women it's all misogynist things. Somebody remember Count Marco. He's spinning in his grave right now because I'm calling him an old queen, but that's what he went. He was from Modesto, John Marco. So they took it on, and to my horror, they said, we'd like you to do it on a daily basis. And then we'd like you to write 30 columns before we start, so we'll have 5 weeks worth of, a backlog, which I rapidly ate up.
You had been a journalist, but had you written fiction before you started?
Very little. Right. Maybe one story in a creative writing class in college.
So it was really a product at the beginning of opportunity that you couldn't get. It reminds me of that Mary Tyler Moore Show episode where they try to do the live documentary on a singles bar, and as soon as the cameras get turned on, all of the singles leave. Nobody wants to be on TV.
Right.
So it was really a kind of, the initial impetus was opportunity. You had this idea to write, you had the story you wanted to write, but you couldn't source it.
And I quit the AP. I came here to work for the AP initially. And I was terrible at it because I couldn't just grind out a story really fast. I was, and I always wanted to make the story better.
Right. So then you're the ideal candidate for a daily fictional column.
Yeah, I was. They sent me on an assignment to cover the King of the Gypsies over in Richmond. And I went on for years with it. It was supposed to be just tossed in, and I was trying to get it right. There was a guy, I have to tell this story, I don't know why, just revenge, I guess. There was a guy I worked with in the AP office there in Fox Plaza. This is 1972, I guess. And I came in one night to report from my shift, and he put his finger in my face and said, I am on to you. I know you're lazy and that you don't work and you don't turn anything out, and I just want you to know I've got your number. 3 years ago, at an autographing session, he came up and asked me to autograph his book. I don't think he remembers the night that he made me feel like a piece of shit, but I did. And I was very gracious. But yeah, it started out. I come rushing into the, they told me I could write it at home, but I kind of liked the idea of working next to Pat Stager, the social columnist, because I could hear what was going on.
When you can weave it all in, right? You can weave it all in.
In a second, and get in terrible trouble doing it. And then they started calling me and telling me, some of the grand dames of the city would tell me this story about the woman who was the society kleptomaniac who was invited to all the parties, but they nailed everything down when she came. And one day she was leaving a luncheon with the ladies, and a Fabergé egg fell out of her pantyhose. And they all knew it, and they were all talking about it, and I fictionalized it and put it in the paper. And my friend Denise Hale later told me, she says, that was the moment that you struck terror into the hearts of everyone.
Well, this was a big advantage, though. I mean, not just the society stuff, but the idea of, it turned out to be, the idea of writing these novels or this novel on a daily basis in a column for the newspaper so that you could be immediately responsive. I mean, one of the early circumstances that you weave into the first book is the whole Anita Bryant issue. You were sort of fortunate, I guess, by having already made Michael's parents be Florida orange growers.
Right.
So I mean, it couldn't have worked out better.
It couldn't have been any better. It was freakish. It was like a gift from heaven. And so I had Michael's mother write him and say, I've joined the Save Our Children campaign. And that prompted me to write his response, which, to hear people tell it, became the model for thousands of people came in and came out at that particular point, men and women. And it was how I told my parents. That's how they were reading the Chronicle, they were subscribing to the Chronicle. And I've always been able to put things in writing better than I have when a confrontation is involved. I'm not good at it. And so that's basically how they found out.
And how was that? I mean, in terms of the response, it's both easy and difficult to remember 1976 and certainly the way sexuality was dealt with in the culture at large, even in San Francisco. Yeah. What was the response to the idea of the story becoming increasingly politicized, increasingly dealing with sexual identity issues, all that kind of stuff?
Well, I always tell a story about the managing editor, Gordon Pates, at the Chronicle, began to realize that there wasn't going to be just this one walk-on by a gay man at the Marina Safeway. And because I began introducing more and more gay and lesbian characters, and he got nervous about it and brought me into his office one day and showed me a chart that he'd made, where he would enter each new Tales of the City character as they appeared, and he had one column said homosexual, and the other one said heterosexual. As the characters appeared, they went into the appropriate column, and at no point were the homosexual characters to rise above 30% of the population. I don't know how he arrived at 30%.
I think it's remarkable that he was keeping track.
I know. He was probably right at that point. Probably was about 30% of the population. But I wrote a column in which Franny Halcyon, the sort of dipsomaniac society matron from Hillsborough, has a long lunch and comes home and passes out in her herb garden and wakes up to find her Great Dane pleasuring himself on her leg. And I made them put the dog in the heterosexual column. I know it sounds coarse in the retelling of it, but it's actually very funny because Dee Dee thinks that her mother's been sexually assaulted, and she's giving this very kind of PC feminist thing as she's trying to be, and she says, "Mother, it's 1976. These things cannot be swept under the rug. You must tell me, who was it? Was it Manuel, the gardener?" Going on this long list. And her mother won't talk about it at all. At the end of it, when it's all over and Dee Dee's left the room, Franny reaches down and scratches the dog under his chin and says, "It's okay, baby, Mama knows you didn't mean it."
So this raises a question too. When you were writing this story for the newspaper, newspapers are notoriously skittish and conservative about language even, let alone anything smacking of sexuality. How did you get it in?
Fighting every day. I will tell a story about Will Hurst in a minute. This is a few years down the line. But it was a negotiation. And I would say, "What do you mean I can't say shit?" "I said shit last week." "Yes, but that was shit kicker. That was part of a word." This is a shit in the first paragraph. Endlessly, something that I had to negotiate. Will and I defected to the Examiner in the fifth, thank you very much, Significant Others, which caused a huge flap because at the last minute they found out that the Chronicle says the Examiner can't use the name Tales of the City, so we had to call it Significant Others. They had to destroy 500,000 copies of the paper because Tales of the City was in the Examiner. I was feeling adventurous. I wanted, I admired Will for he's done some sassy things in his life. And I thought this might be interesting, even though it wasn't the newspaper that everybody was reading. But I wanted to see if people might start picking up the Examiner. The day I signed on the Examiner, Warren Hinkle, the legendary eye-patched Warren Hinkle, says, "Come on, we're going to go celebrate." He took me, this gay man, to the Mitchell Brothers screening room, to the O'Farrell Theater with all the girls lying around half naked on the big smelly poof things in the middle of the room. Sat there and poured back huge tumblers of bourbon with Jim and Artie Mitchell, one of whom later murdered the other one. And I felt I was in, it was and maybe still is, I don't know, maybe it's not still the Wild West, but there was the sense when you were in California that anything could happen and that the material was there for me to use it. It was about that time that I met Robin Williams, and I was up at Robin's ranch, and this kid, we were up there for a party, and this kid came wandering over from a trailer where he was staying there on the ranch, and turned out to be Zach Leary, Timothy Leary's son. And he came up to me and said, "Hey, what's blue and creamy?" 10-year-old. And the answer was Smurf sperm. And I decided this would be a perfect thing to put into Tales of the City. Because I had these 10-year-old kids with lesbian moms. I was very proud of the fact, by the way, they were some of the first lesbian moms in pop culture, really. Dee Dee and Dorothea had these kids. And I thought it was especially funny if the kids were doing things that were going, "Oh shit, what do we do now?" And Will saw the newspaper and called me up and said, "Army, we can't have Smurf sperm in the Examiner." And we actually, where are you while I'm talking about you? Hello, sir. We negotiated over, I remember him saying, "Oh, geez, don't give me such a hard time. I let you have that J.O. party last week." So then we talked about it. He said, what if we say, "What's blue and makes babies?" So that's what we settled on.
But you still got to use,
women like that. Aww.
but you still got to use Smurf sperm.
I got to use Smurf sperm.
It's got to be the only recorded newspaper editor-writer negotiation about Smurf sperm.
Ever. But we could talk to each other in the best kind of way, and a serious outcome of that was that year, it was really becoming more and more, people were growing more and more angry in the gay community that the local newspapers would not print the partners of people who were dying of AIDS because they weren't technically biological family members and they weren't married. And so they were being made invisible in the obituaries, and all I had to do was to say 2 words to Will about it, and he called an editorial meeting and he said, "Make your pitch," and I did, and the Examiner's policy was changed right on the spot. From that moment on, 1987.
So I want to talk about this kind of idea of using the novel or using the fiction as a, you know, as a social force in a certain way.
Yeah.
And
I think I didn't get on that, did I? Really?
No, it's all right. But
wander.
But we talked. I mentioned the Anita Bryant thing. You wrote about the People's Temple. That was a major theme in one of the books. John Fielding, who I think is the first character in American literature, certainly, to die of AIDS. All of these kind of elements, they really opened up a discussion in many ways. I know that was part of your intent.
Yeah.
Was that part of your intent going in, or did, as you continued to write this thing, did you begin to sort of think differently about how it operated?
Well, I became aware of it as soon as the Anita Bryant thing happened. I realized I had the power to write that letter and to tell that story.
And wasn't there resistance to? I mean,
I had a bit of a showdown with Dick Terriot at one point because I'd written a column in which, if you remember the Anita Bryant, what happened after Anita Bryant was dead, went ahead and passed this heinous thing in South Florida. And I was reading things from gay people who were basically saying, well, time to go back into the closet. And Michael made a little speech to someone when I came out of the closet. I nailed the door shut. And I found out after the fact, some couple of allies, women, almost always been women, by the way, over the years, from the People Department called me and said that column's being pulled because they think it will upset the people in the sunset. What they imagine to be in the sunset. But the truth was that when Michael's life was threatened with Guillain-Barré syndrome, before there was AIDS, I had people, I remember one writing and saying, I'm nothing but a middle-aged housewife from Moraga with 2 little machos of my own, but if you kill Michael Tolliver, I will never subscribe to the Chronicle again. So I knew that there was power, and I told Dick, I said, if you don't run it, I'm done. I'm not going to do it anymore. And I sat there for about 3 hours thinking, you idiot. And he called back and said, oh, all right, go ahead.
And then you really had the power.
And then I really had the power.
Yeah.
So I never got rich off of it. The newspapermen in this town are very shrewd about that. But I knew what the support was.
So
and everyone's credit, the times were moving. We were all on it. It was just a great wave we were riding, and we were changing the rules as we went along. Everybody was. And I was thrilled as a writer to be able to do that, to have this fresh material that no one else had. It was extraordinary for me. I was amazed that I had this opportunity to tell a story and to be funny about it and to make people care about the characters, to make people care about the non-liberal. One of my favorite things ever was in Significant Others, for which I did for the Examiner, was when Buddha Manigo, the old right-wing Reaganite, is up at the Bohemian Grove, and he passes out in a canoe because his best friend just died of a heart attack while in drag at the Grove play. And he drifts down the river and into a women's music festival that's camped. And is immediately kidnapped by the women and held hostage. And he's finally rescued by a tough old bull dyke named Mabel, who's there with a Winnebago, and she starts talking about how much she loves the Star Wars program and Reagan, and he's looking at her in amazement, and he says, what are you doing here at the Women's Music Festival? And she looks at him and sort of snorts and said, pussy. And those are my favorite moments, when very unlikely people, seemingly unlikely people, collide and find something in common.
Well, I think this has been true since the beginning. When I think about Anna Madrigal and Edgar Halcyon, who seem to be, the most opposite of characters. You can hardly imagine them together, and yet their story is really one of the central stories of the first book.
that's what I'm, one of these days, if we ever get that musical to Broadway, I hope we do, everyone agrees that it should be retooled more as Anna's story and that central love story, because I'm really very proud of that, the notion of those two people finding each other and having to tell their own truths before he dies, essentially. And I have a moment in the days of Anna Madrigal. You know he's from Stanford. He tells her at the very beginning when she meets him on the park bench in Washington Square that he went to this brothel in Winnemucca, and then she tells him, my mother ran that place, and he remembers the name of the woman. That woman in the brothel plays a major role in the days of Anna Madrigal. You find out exactly what role she played in Anna's life.
So let me ask you about this, because in Marianne and Autumn you bring back plot threads from the first Tales of the City novel. In this new novel you're bringing back that plot line. How do you keep it all in your head? I mean, how do you
I'm a little...
I was going to say, how do you keep it all straight, but I didn't want to say
Yes. You don't need to avoid those things to be done. I worry that I don't. I mean, there have been readers who've written and found discrepancies. I went back and did a little reading this time to make sure I got some time frame things right. I don't know, I think I just kind of developed this, I hesitate to call it a computer, but from the beginning I had to jiggle these daily episodes, and then I had to make them into something, and then I make sure that the novel was a self-contained entity that fed you the right, all the information you needed if this was the first one you ever picked up. I'm really proud of that. I think you can do that with any of the 9 novels. You can read them on their own. But there's something in me that says, okay, this person has to come back now. There hasn't been enough of this person. That's helped. The internet has helped a lot. I mean, after Marianne and Autumn, somebody would say, where's Brian? I want to know what Brian's doing. And I would go to that. And then I do the math and figure out how old they are in relation to my own age, because I've always done whether they were exactly my age, or in the case of Michael, 7 years younger. And I don't have a real answer for that, and there may be, I think there may be a lot of discrepancies, I don't know.
And
I don't have charts or anything like that.
A whole bunch of stuff in a real computer.
Yeah.
Once you decided to go back, I mean, we talked earlier about returning to Michael to write a survivor story, but you could have left it at that, rather than continuing and writing the subsequent 2 novels. What kept you there?
The other characters were kind of demanding attention, and I could feel, and I also wanted to not leave Marianne, just as I didn't want to leave Michael dead, I didn't want to leave her a bitch. I've never felt that way. I don't, by the way, use that word in real life. But a lot of people use it with me. And I've never seen her that way, I guess because there is so much of myself in her. What I did with her was sort of let my own ambition be hers, and sort of as a caveat to myself, I think, to don't lose touch with the things that brought you here, and so I had to give her a hard time in that novel. I had to give her something really tough to deal with. It's funny because I still worry about spoilers even after all these years, but as people who've read Marianne and Autumn know, she comes down with a uterine cancer. And Laura Linney, who had become, in my mind, in the minds of many people, the embodiment of Marianne, suddenly announced, and we were very close friends, but she kept this kind of close, that she was doing the Big C on Showtime, that her character had cancer. And it was quite eerie to feel that those parallel dramas, to watch the show and then realize I was writing about it in my own way. That was one of the great benefits one of the great gifts of this adventure has been that the actors who created these roles that become very close friends of mine, and many of them are so close to the mark. I mean, Olympia Dukakis is that kind of an Earth Mother. She is that person.
I was going to ask you about that.
She gave me pop on my birthday. It wasn't something she had around. She sent her assistant out and said, "Get him some nice grass."
Did the miniseries affect the way you thought about the characters? Did you begin to sort of either visualize them as those actors, or the portrayals got into the way that you thought about how
It
they
was a great help. It was a huge help, because I think maybe, I don't know if you've ever felt it, but a lot of writers read their own work and think, this is just me, talking to me, talking to, you know.
I've never had that.
You've never had that. You're just, you're trying to disguise the fact that you're pulling something from your own life, from your own heart, to invent a so seemingly brand new character, but when you hear their voices, they're kind of your own. So after the miniseries happened, I could start hearing Laura's voice, Olympia's voice. Those are the two main ones. But it was very useful to me. I could imagine how they would play the scene. Laura and I are very similar, personality-wise. We both were raised to be good little kids by Southern parents, and we both know how to be gracious on the outside, while inside we're thinking, this is the biggest idiot I've ever talked to in my life. We all do that. You know, you put on a friendly face, and then underneath you're thinking something else. And Marianne is written kind of that way. You kind of see what she's thinking. And so as a consequence, I guess our friendship was inevitable, because we sort of have the same responses to things.
Yeah, it's interesting with Marianne, because I've noticed, I think when I first read Sure of You, throughout, but when I first read Sure of You, I was sort of shocked by her. But then looking back at the earlier books, you can see the seeds of it in her behavior. I mean, even in the idea that, you know, she comes to San Francisco on a vacation and then decides to stay, and then basically discards Connie.
Yeah.
Blows her off entirely. There's always a sort of, maybe we can call her a little bit of a ruthless streak in her.
Yeah, there is. I like that about her. She's more fun to write for that reason, because, you know, it's all sweetness and light on the outside. And keep in mind, I knew when I was writing Sure of You, the book 6, that I was leaving.
Right.
And so I sort of used it for Marianne, thinking she's leaving. She's getting out of town. She's got this, what she thinks is this great job offer in New York, and she's never been all that happy with her husband, and that kid was Connie's kid to begin with, and she rationalizes deserting her family. It all works out at Burning Man, you'll be happy to know, Bruce. A lot of the days of Anna Madrigal is set at Burning Man and Winnemucca. I went again with my husband Chris this year, so I could be sure I remembered correctly what happened last year.
And did you?
Yes.
I just want to ask you a couple more questions, and then I want to turn it over.
Yeah.
I'm sure we have some questions from the audience. One thing I want to talk about a little bit is the idea, too, that all the characters are tough in the sense that, I mean, a variety of ways, but in Marianne and Autumn, they don't just welcome her back. You know, she has to prove herself. They have long memories. They know what happened. And it doesn't get swept under the rug, even though she's sick. And I think that's one of the, you know, when you say it isn't all sweetness and light, there is always that kind of hard edge of reality. The books are funny, but they're also tragic and real in that sense. I wanted to sort of ask your...
Thank you for that, by the way. I hate being called, you know, sentimental, because I'm really not.
I don't think they're sentimental at all.
Yeah. It's because it's the way life is. That's the way life is. You don't get to fix everything, but you can have these little tender moments of understanding, and yet it doesn't tie up. The Days of Anna Madrigal doesn't tie up, because there is no moment in life when that happens. I try to have a few little resolutions, but it just goes on.
Right. Well, you said in some interview I read that I think you said you don't write endings. You don't write endings.
Yeah.
Because the story doesn't end.
Yeah, I don't. And I've not, even when I've departed to two other novels of mine, both of which I'm proud of, Maybe the Moon and The Night Listener, which is sort of a psychological thriller. Thank you. There are characters from Tales of the City in there, so I don't quite leave the universe. Gabriel Noon, the writer in The Night Listener, employs an accountant, a bookkeeper, who is Anna Halcyon Wilson, the daughter of D.E. Halcyon Day. Which makes Sandra Oh, who played her in the movie, the only actor to play two different characters in Tales of the City, because she's also Bambi Kanataka, the ruthless newscaster. I only did that so for years I would have Wendy Takuda and Jan Yanahiro fighting over whether I was writing about either one of them.
So the last question I want to ask you is, you wrote it as a serial for the first 5 books. Sure View you wrote as a standalone. Did you continue writing it as a serial after you had to, or did you stop writing it as a serial as soon as you could? I mean, that may be an economic question, or it may be a creative question. And what was the difference once you were not writing it in short installments on a daily deadline? Was there a difference in how you produced it, or in your sense of how the process worked, or did you adapt it? Was it fairly similar?
It was gradual. I knew, by the time I got to Significant Others, which was the last one I did for a newspaper, for the Examiner, by then I knew how, okay, I'm going to stop here and this will work as a daily thing, but I know that 5 of these will make a longer chapter. And I taught myself to sort of figure out how to do that. The process, it really is a gradual process. At the very beginning, when Harvey Ginsberg called me from Harper and Row and said, I think there's a novel in this, can you see what you can do? I had just become friends, actually the night before Tales of the City appeared in the Chronicle. I met Rock Hudson. And he stood up rather drunkenly and sweetly, having gone down to the desk at the Fairmont Hotel and bought the Bulldog edition of the Chronicle and said, I have a little reading to do. And he read the first chapter of Tales of the City to about 6 or 7 of us guys who were hanging out there with him. And it actually mentioned Macmillan and Wife in the column. Very weird. And 2 years later, we'd become good friends, and he said, use the Palm Springs house if you need to get away. And, right, so I was on the floor of Rock Hudson's living room with all of the chapters. There were many more than ended up in it. Moving them around to try to make them work better. Creating surprises that I didn't even know. It was like a puzzle, a wonderful puzzle. And then as it went along, I began to realize how I could make it work for the novel while I was reading on a daily basis. And Sure View was written strictly as a novel.
As did all the subsequent.
All the subsequent ones.
All right, so let me ask you
The reason I did, to answer your question, is it's really hard work. It's excruciating and terrifying if you're doing it in real time.
Right. Well, the benefit of being able to respond to what's happening in the news is also the terror. You're walking that tightrope where you're basically putting your first draft out into print.
Absolutely. That's what I was doing.
Yeah.
But it was there. The immediacy of it was wonderful. If I met a guy one night at a bar in the Castro who was really fascinated by me and as a sex object, apparently, and a long time ago. And it turned out I was wearing Weegians, and he was hot for my shoes. He was a Weegians fetishist. We went to his apartment, and he had framed pictures of Weegians. Yeah, it was scary as hell. Then I found found out that he was the night clerk at the Huntington Hotel, which at the time was one of the last hotels in America that would shine your shoes if you left them outside the door at night. And he would cruise the halls at night, looking for regions.
And then he would steal them, or he would just...
I don't know what he did with them, I don't want to know.
It's the novelist's job to imagine what he was doing.
Yeah, well.
I was going to ask another question, but I think we'll stop. Okay. Now let's turn it over to some questions from the audience. You guys, there's a microphone there, which we need you to use because it's for the taping. So if you can just stand up and come to that microphone there. It's right over there. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. All right, I'll call on people, and then you can, or you can all line up if you want to.
Or you can shout it out and we can repeat the questions.
You can shout out and repeat the questions too.
Hi guys, thanks for being here.
Hi, Ben.
I want to take a moment to thank Armisted, which I've done before, but when I was coming out of the closet, I didn't have It Gets Better, but I had Tales of the City, and that worked for me. And made a difference in my life, and taught me that there was a gay community to come out to, and it had an enormous impact on me, and it was a life.
You know, that means more to me than anything. I should just be on record as saying that single thing, maybe not just limited to gay people, but anybody who felt the freedom to be, finally felt the freedom to be themselves by reading those books. That has been my reward.
I know people who... people move to San Francisco because of your books and they're not gay. The question I wanted to ask you, as a big-time reader and as a somewhat OCD reader, particularly with, I think, the first two serials, when you turned them into books, you made a lot of changes. And there were plot lines that were developed.
Yeah, I knew you'd come here and haunt me with this.
Plot lines that were developing. Things about Edgar Halligan's son-in-law, whether he was still alive.
Yeah, somebody had a baby in a cat box or something.
The sequence with the more mature ladies at sex camp where they go up and there were people involved in that you were obviously developing. And then you turn it into a book and they vanish. And I'll admit,
Pinus was still there.
Yeah, I'll admit that I was like looking forward to those lines. How did you make the transition from the first couple of series to turning them into books, and how do you feel about the plot lines you abandoned?
I was happy to get a second crack at it because I watch these long-form television shows that I love so much right now, and when you watch them jumping the shark, as it were, in the second or third season, I'm completely sympathetic because you run out of new ways to keep people on the hook. And I felt that some of those more extreme plot lines were exactly what I was doing, and that I had to go back and trust the fact that people cared about these characters. And the more I rooted it in that, the better I was. They become more naturalistic as they go along for that very reason, because I didn't feel I had to have the Episcopal cannibal cult.
So I'm a big fan, and you mentioned that when you created 28 Barbary Lane, you wanted people to go find it. About a year ago, my boyfriend and I woke up and we're like, hey, what are we going to do today? I was like, we're going to go find Barbary Lane. And we did. We found Barbary Lane and took a picture. Anyway. Yep.
A little closer to the mic. She's saying that she and her boyfriend went looking for Barbary Lane, found Macondry Lane, and took a picture.
And we walked down it and we found the rickety old wooden steps and we enjoyed ourselves. My question is, you said that you were more like Dee Dee or like Marianne than you were Michael, but like Michael, you also married a much younger man. How much of each character is autobiographical?
It's just an honest and direct proportion to how much it might embarrass me to be. I use a lot of my own life, but a lot of it is made up, and so I find that it infuses it with some sort of reality if you can pull from your own experience. Christopher and I met the way Michael and Ben did. He saw, Michael sees Ben on a site for a non-ageist personal site for gay men. And then sees him on the street, which is exactly what happened to me and Chris. I had to do it the old-fashioned way by chasing him halfway down the street. By the way, that age different thing came to play in an amusing way when we were in Hollywood this year, because Olympia Dukakis was given a star on the Walk of Fame at the age of 82, and was asked if we'd come down and participate in the ceremony. And the person who presented the award to her was Ed Asner, her old friend and liberal, kick-ass, great guy. Ed Asner, who, he looks exactly like the guy in Up, you know? And he had a minor role, a cameo role in Tales of the City, so I went up and said, I'm Armisted Maupin. I want to thank you so much for being in our miniseries. And this is my husband, Christopher Turner. And he turned to Christopher and said, then turned back to me and said, "You've got great taste." And then he turned to Chris and said, "I want to thank you for getting another senior citizen off the street."
Hi, I love the casting of characters in the miniseries, and I see you did too. And I wanted to know if you had a say in the casting of those characters.
First of all, most of the credit goes to a brilliant guy named John Lyons, who also cast the Coen Brothers movies, you know, Fargo, all those movies, and really knows how to nail, you know, the smaller roles even. Just brilliant. And then he went out and got people like McLean Stevenson and Edie Adams, and who else? Rod Steiger is in Tales of the City. I suggested Olympia, and Laura came to read. Interestingly enough, Laura came to read for the role of Dee Dee, because she said they always hauled her in for the intelligent but wounded characters, and they were after some young actress who was hot at the moment that we've never even heard of now. For Mary Ann, and it fell through, and they said, "We've got to do this. Do you think this woman would be good for Mary Ann?" And they sent me the tape, and I couldn't believe it. It was just the embodiment. She just utterly understood it. And I was in awe of her from the moment she arrived on the set. She wasn't famous at the time, but it was just very clear that she was exactly what her gift was. But I stayed out of it for the most part. I was a little bit afraid that my specific image of a character might dictate it too much. You know, John Fielding is described as sort of a Nordic god in Tales of the City. And Billy Campbell played him. Well, I'd hate to have missed out on Billy Campbell just because he wasn't blonde, you know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
At a reading for The Night Listener in like 1999 in Portland, Oregon, I stood up and asked you if you would ever be revisiting Tales of the City characters. And you said, oh, no, nobody wants to hear from those old. They're old now. Who wants to hear from them? So I feel a little bit responsible for these later Tales of the City.
Okay. I've also adjusted my idea of what old is. I seem to be doing that a lot.
The Tales seem to have such a life after like musicals and radio adaptations and the miniseries. What did you, I saw the musical here at ACT, and I wondered how you felt about the musical and you know what's happening with the musical and other stuff that's going to be coming with Tales and other stuff you might be working on.
The problem with the musical or the team is that they've all gone on to do these amazing things, and they're so busy. I don't think we'll ever get them back together. Jason Moore, our director, did Pitch Perfect and now Pitch Perfect 2, and Jeff Whitty did that Bring It On, the cheerleader musical, and now he's just been hired by Gwyneth Paltrow to write a musical about the Go-Go's. he moved mysteriously to LA this year, and I could not figure out why did he just confirm New York or move to LA. Well, Gwyneth Paltrow, that's the answer to that. But anyway, they've had great careers and are busy. Jake Shears has been on the road forever. I loved it. I saw it 17 times. I loved it. I know what it needed to be done. We all agreed that, you know, a pederast was not really a good thing in a musical. It works in some odd way because it's all off screen in the book, but it didn't work. And the Norman character didn't work. And as I said earlier, it became clearer and clearer that it should have been Anna's show. She's the diva at the center of it, and she should have been it's not about Mary Ann coming to town, it's about this amazing Earth Mother who has this apartment house and these two people who come in. But having said that, I felt so lucky we had Betsy Wolfe in the role of Mary Ann. She's brilliant, and she's doing everything now. And I thought Wes Taylor, who played Michael, was just, I thought he was the best Michael yet, really. I thought he really caught the spirit of the character. But it was so much fun for me just to have that backstage musical experience. Really.
So I really enjoyed reading the whole series, but there's kind of two parts to it. The original part, and now this part. I'm now looking forward to reading the next novel, coming out in January. But I'm also looking forward to, in about 15, 20 years, having your husband keep you alive and write the next part of the series.
I'm picturing that. What do you mean?
We want more!
Like, just my head is a big tank.
A large petri dish.
Thank you, Bruce, for wanting my husband to keep me alive. If anybody could, he could. It's funny. There is this thing now. You all tell me whether I should do it. There's a new thing at Amazon called Amazon World, where you release your material to other writers and they keep the story going. Good, bad, scary as hell.
Complicated.
Scares me. I don't. Fascinating idea. It's a compliment in the sense that people think they know the characters, so if someone can keep it going, it's like fan fiction, basically, but written by, hopefully, by people who can write. I don't think I want to, but I think I want them to die with me.
Well, thank you so much. I found your work by PBS, loved the show, then went to your books, and then wanted more, and then they never showed the second one on my local PBS, and then after writing a donation for after the first one, wrote them an angry letter when they didn't show the second one, and that was like the end for PBS for me. But the thing that struck me...
It was for Jessica Mitford, too. She got it before an audience in Oakland and tore up her PBS card over it. It's like the biggest compliment in the world.
But what struck me in the books was basically it was the first time that it was just almost given that where gay people were referring to their partners as husbands and wives. And it seems, at that time when I read it, that it was, that's a nice idea, a nice concept, and how quickly it's come. I mean, it really, from the 80s or the 90s, which is when the show came out, and people were referring, or in the books at least, I don't remember if it was in the PBS, but that were referring to men and women as husbands and wives of each other. And how happy I am that, now it's becoming a reality. And,
yeah, that's cool. Thank you. That was still a tough one for some. I mean, not the notion of the marriage, but the nomenclature. Chris and I were recently had the great joy of meeting Dr. Ruth Westheimer. Yeah, she's charming beyond belief. And when I met her, I was able to say thank you so much for everything, because she spoke out about AIDS very early on. She just reduced it to everyone's love life, and this is just the way it is. She's a lovely, lovely person with an extraordinary history. She was a sniper in the Israeli army. She escaped from the Holocaust and became a sniper in the Israeli army. She never shot anybody, she said, but it's such an image, isn't she? She's about as tall as Ed Asner, you know. But we were with Alan Cumming and his husband, who recently married. They've been together for 12 years, the actor Alan Cumming. And he said, "This is my husband, Grant." And she said, "Does that make you the wife?" And I heard that from a very distinguished writer from the New Yorker, a really educated liberal guy who, I heard that same question, and it made me realize that the biggest struggle for gay folks is to these gender strictures that are so built into our society. Is it really that hard to understand that a male spouse is a husband and a female spouse is a wife? But the roles imposed upon, still in our society, upon heterosexual couples make it harder for people to understand the concept among homosexual couples. And I think that people who worry that we're breaking down traditional values are absolutely right. We are, and it's all for the good, especially the women.
From the last, I'm a librarian. I'm also a queer fourth-generation San Franciscan, so I can't thank you. Well, it would take too much time. Thank you.
Thank you for that description too. You weren't, all four generations weren't queer, were they?
Oh, I wish. One third.
All right, cool.
Quick question. I'll try to. Why did you kill Mona?
Keep an eye on that woman. I'm worried about her. Because people die, and I had a very personal interest in breast cancer, specifically in the way it takes people out of our lives. My mother died of it. My sister's the only female member of our family, going back several generations, who has died from this epidemic, which is what it is. And I suppose it was the same reason that I killed John Fielding, because people have to be made to feel the reality of these things, and sometimes they feel it far more strongly through fictional characters than they do through what's happening around them. So that was largely the reason. Because I loved her, I guess. Hey, that is Donna. How are you doing? Thank you, Donna.
Anna Madrigal is such a character, and you obviously love her, and you say the story centers around her. Was there an Anna Madrigal in your life? Did you have a transsexual friend or a person that had a secret, or where did that all come from?
Several transsexual people just fascinated me early on. One was someone named Gordon Langley Hall, who moved to Charleston, South Carolina in the 60s, who was the foster son, the adopted son, of Dame Margaret Rutherford from the old Miss Marple movies. Remember Dame Margaret Rutherford? And he wrote books about famous women and became the toast of Charleston society until he started going to Johns Hopkins, the gender reassignment clinic at Johns Hopkins, and came back to Charleston and was already dressing as a woman. And then fell in love with an African-American shrimp boat fisherman. I mean, She, by that time, had broken every rule in the book and was really shunned by people in Charleston, and wrote several books about it. And she died about 5 years ago, and look it up, it's Dawn Langley Hall. The obituary in the New York Times was one of the most moving things I've ever read, because it was a series of apologies from people who said, we treated her terribly. We are so ashamed of how we behaved. And I was a naval ensign at the time. I remember reading about it on a printout. Well, I can't even remember what it was called at the time, but in the communications thing that it came out, kind of telegraph thing, there was the story in the Charleston paper. So she fascinated me. And then when I first moved to San Francisco, and I was doing freelance work for the Pacific Sun, someone named Kate Marlowe, who was still Kenneth Marlowe, a hairdresser down on Union Street, was undergoing the reassignment surgery, but had to pay for it. Very expensive. And hired Sally Rand, the old fan dancer.
Wow.
Used to be at the Music Box. She was 70 then, and still doing her famous fan dance under a 3-watt blue bulb. And the Benny Goodman Orchestra. And they had a party of old farts at California Hall, all dancing to the Benny Goodman Orchestra and watching Sally Rand perform. And Kate Marlowe, bless her heart, named the event "The Ball to End All Balls."
Only in San Francisco.
Yeah. Kate Marlowe, by the way, told the story that she had grown up in a whorehouse in Winnemucca, Nevada. And so I lifted that detail and felt, actually later I thought I really should get in touch with her and let her know that's where that came from. And I found in the thrift shop an old memoir that she had written. And she said that her parents were a gangster in his mall in Chicago, so she was a little colorful. But those were mainly that's where I got that. That's where I became aware of it, and then I imbued it with the spirit of my grandmother, who was a suffragist when she was a young woman and a loving, expansive person, and I just melded the whole thing and thought, I want people to love this woman. You know. Thank you.
I want to thank you for talking with me, and
Thank you, Brian.
and thank you all for coming.
A total pleasure. Thank you so much.